The Rocky Mountains have always carried a dual reputation, majestic beauty laced with unforgiving danger. In the summer of 2001, Mark and Emily Turner, newlyweds from Denver, set off for what was meant to be the perfect beginning to their marriage. Just weeks after exchanging vows, they decided to take a short honeymoon trip into the Rockies, combining Mark's love of hiking with Emily's passion for photography. Friends recalled how excited they were, talking about camping beneath the stars and waking up to mountain air. They were young, vibrant, and seemingly invincible. But the Rockies are not a place that forgives mistakes. When the couple failed to return home on schedule, their families immediately knew something was wrong. The Turners were responsible, always checking in. Panic set in when their cell phones went unanswered, and no one had heard from them in days. Authorities launched a search, but the vastness of the mountains quickly swallowed their efforts. Helicopters scanned ridges and valleys, while ground teams combed trails, but not a trace was found. No footprints, no campsite, no gear. It was as if the newlyweds had stepped off the map entirely. At first, some speculated they had chosen to extend their honeymoon, but those closest to them insisted otherwise. "They wouldn't do this," Emily's mother said firmly in an interview. "They had jobs, responsibilities, and family waiting. Something happened to them out there." Days turned into weeks, and the search stretched further into the rugged terrain. Dogs were brought in, tracking parties spread out, but storms rolled in, burying potential clues beneath fresh snow. The Rockies, beautiful as they were, became a labyrinth of dead ends. By September, the official search was scaled back. Heartbroken families clung to hope, but privately many believed the mountains had claimed yet another pair of lives. For 2 decades, the mystery of the Turners lingered. Hikers occasionally reported seeing abandoned tents or discarded clothing, sparking rumors that their belongings might one day be found. Online forums dedicated to cold cases debated endlessly. Had they fallen victim to an accident, to wildlife, or perhaps even foul play? Theories multiplied, but evidence remained scarce. Until the winter of 2021. That year brought an unusually harsh freeze, locking the Rockies in ice deeper than in recent memory. When the spring thaw finally came, rivers swelled, glaciers shifted, and hidden things began to surface. A group of climbers ascending a remote glacier reported seeing something strange embedded in the ice. At first, it looked like a scrap of paper, preserved against all odds by 2 decades of frozen silence. When they chipped it free, the truth emerged. It was a wedding invitation. The names Mark and Emily Turner, still legible in faded ink, stretched across its surface. The date, July 2001. The climbers, stunned, turned the artifact over to authorities. It was a discovery that reopened the case and reignited old fears. How had the invitation ended up encased in the glacier? Had the Turners themselves been nearby when the ice sealed their fate? Investigators returned to the Rockies, focusing now on the region where the invitation had been found. Families who had endured 20 years of silence suddenly faced a new surge of media attention. Reporters descended on the town at the mountain's base, calling it one of the most chilling mysteries of the decade. For the first time in 20 years, there was a tangible link to the missing couple. But the invitation was not the only thing the glacier had been hiding. As the thaw continued and more ice fractured, a darker discovery was about to emerge, one that would push the story from tragedy into nightmare. The discovery of the wedding invitation spread like wildfire, igniting both local and national interest in the Turners' case. For years, their disappearance had been little more than a tragic mystery filed away in police archives. Now, 2 decades later, the mountains themselves seemed to be giving up their secrets. Investigators hiked to the glacier, where the climbers had made their find. The journey was treacherous, requiring hours of navigating icy ridges and unstable ground. When they reached the site, they found fragments of fabric caught in the ice nearby. Their colors faded but still distinguishable as once bright tones. Some believed it might have been part of Emily's hiking jacket, remembered in photographs from the summer of 2001. Carefully, the fragments were collected and sent for testing. But even as forensic teams worked, nature itself revealed more. Just days after the invitation surfaced, the thaw expanded a jagged crevasse along the glacier's edge. Inside, Partially frozen and twisted in layers of ice, searchers spotted the faint outline of something unmistakably human. Word of the discovery reached the families before officials could confirm it. Emily's brother drove straight to the ranger station, trembling as he asked the only question that mattered: is it them? Authorities refused to speculate until recovery could be attempted, but privately, most involved believed the Turners were finally being found. Yet the conditions were perilous. Ice was unstable, threatening to collapse around recovery teams. The body, or what remained of it, was locked in a cocoon of ice that resisted even industrial drills. Reporters swarmed the mountain-based town, turning it into a circus of speculation. Some networks replayed old footage from 2001, interviews with grieving parents who had begged for answers. Others focused on the eerie detail of the invitation, noting how rare it was for paper to survive intact for so long. Scientists explained that the glacier's unique freeze had created a near-perfect preservation chamber, raising the chilling possibility that more than paper might have been preserved within. By the time recovery teams finally breached the ice, a crowd of journalists and family members gathered at a safe distance, waiting. Hours passed, filled with the sound of drills, shovels, and the crackling groan of shifting ice. At last, rescuers pulled free the first visible remains, a hiking boot, stiff and frozen, its leather cracked but intact. Inside was a pale fragment of bone. DNA testing would be required, but even at first glance the size suggested it had belonged to a man. The boot sent shockwaves through the families. Mark's parents clutched each other, tears streaming, while Emily's mother collapsed into her daughter's arms. But investigators warned them not to assume anything yet. The Rockies had claimed countless hikers over decades, and bones did not always belong to the missing. Still, the timing was chilling. Alongside the boot, rescuers retrieved a torn strap that looked like part of a backpack, its nylon warped but recognizable. Stenciled faintly on the strap were initials: MT Mark Turner. The crowd gasped, reporters shouted questions, and the story exploded once again across the country. For many it was proof that Mark had indeed died on the mountain, his body claimed by the ice. But if Mark's remains were here, where was Emily? That question grew louder as the glacier continued to thaw. Forensic teams scanned deeper into the crevasse, cameras lowered on ropes capturing eerie images of what lay beneath the ice. At first, it appeared to be only jagged stone and frozen water. Then, just beyond the range of the lights, the faint shape of another figure appeared, twisted and frozen in a position that suggested a struggle. Yet something about the shape seemed wrong. Limbs bent at unnatural angles, the outline distorted as though pressed against the ice by something immense. The recovery team froze, unsure if they were looking at Emily or at something that had never been human at all. The camera footage from the glacier's depths sent ripples of unease through the investigation. The outline trapped within the ice appeared human at first glance, but its posture was grotesque, as though frozen mid-contortion. Arms were twisted unnaturally, the torso bent sharply backward, the head tilted at an impossible angle. Some rescuers swore it looked as though the body had been crushed. Others whispered that the shape seemed larger than Emily's slight frame. Officials remained cautious, calling for patience until the figure could be extracted. Still, word spread quickly, and speculation ignited. Had the Turners suffered a fall, their bodies twisted by impact? Or had something else happened on that mountain 20 years ago? Recovery crews returned the following morning with stronger equipment, determined to cut deeper into the glacier. Hours of drilling echoed through the valley, the sound bouncing off stone walls like a dirge. By afternoon, the ice cracked away enough to reveal fragments of fabric clinging to the frozen figure. It was a pale color, perhaps once white, but stained and yellowed by decades in the ice. Emily's mother was shown photographs from a distance. She trembled as she recognized it. Emily's wedding dress, repurposed as a hiking tunic during their trip, had been cut at the hem for comfort. She had laughed about wanting to carry a piece of her wedding with her into the mountains. That laugh now haunted everyone. The evidence suggested the second body was indeed Emily, though the position remained disturbing. As teams worked to extract her, they noticed something else embedded in the ice near her arm, a metallic glint. Careful chiseling revealed a small silver locket, its chain tangled around her wrist. Inside, remarkably preserved, was a wedding photo of her and Mark, smiling and youthful, a cruel reminder of the innocence lost. For a moment, the Glacier seemed to fall silent. Even the seasoned rescuers paused, shaken by the intimacy of the discovery. But as Emily's remains were slowly freed, an unsettling detail emerged. Beneath her, the ice held another layer, deeper shadows, darker impressions, shapes that didn't resemble rock or natural formations. Cameras sent lower into the crevasse picked up lines, almost like scratches carved into the ice itself. Some were straight, others curved, spiraling across the frozen walls. The images unsettled investigators. Glacial movement, one geologist offered, though his voice betrayed doubt. The patterns seemed deliberate, too organized to be random fractures. They resembled markings, perhaps even symbols. As the news reached the base camp, the story shifted. It was no longer simply about the tragic discovery of two newlyweds. Questions arose. What else was hidden in that ice? What had happened on that mountain in 2001 that left behind not just bodies, but carvings? Reporters pressed authorities for answers, but officials dodged, insisting the markings could not yet be confirmed. Meanwhile, families grieved as DNA tests moved forward to officially identify the remains. But at night, under the glow of campfires, whispers spread among the rescuers themselves. Several swore they had heard faint sounds echoing from within the crevasse, groans, cracks, even whispers carried by the wind. Most dismissed it as stress or imagination. Yet one climber, who had first spotted the invitation, insisted otherwise. "That ice has been holding more than just bodies," he said quietly. "It's been holding something back." The following morning, when the glacier shifted again with a thunderous crack, rescuers found that the crevasse had deepened overnight. And now something new was visible below Emily's distorted outline. The corner of what looked like a man-made object, dark and angular, buried in ice for decades. The angular object peeking through the ice immediately shifted the tone of the investigation. What had begun as a tragic recovery of two lost hikers was quickly evolving into something stranger. At first glance, the shape looked metallic, a flat edge protruding from the ice wall directly below where Emily's remains had been trapped. Its surface, though dulled by frost, reflected the light of headlamps in a way that rock never could. Rescuers, unsure whether they were looking at debris or evidence, contacted specialists from the State Forensic Unit. Until they arrived, the glacier site was cordoned off, leaving family members and reporters frustrated and desperate for answers. Rumors spread quickly. Some speculated the Turners had stumbled onto the wreckage of an old aircraft, perhaps even part of a Cold War-era crash. Others whispered of military equipment hidden in the mountains, its secrecy guarded by time and ice. Emily's brother, interviewed by local news, voiced what many feared. If that's man-made, and they found it, maybe that's why they never came back. Within days, recovery crews equipped with stronger drills and thermal cutters began the painstaking work of exposing the object. As ice flaked away, more of its form came into view. A box-like structure, edges sharp and deliberate, its surface stamped with faint markings nearly erased by time. The strange lines carved into the surrounding ice seemed to converge toward it, as if the glacier itself had formed around the structure. By the third day, investigators managed to free one panel entirely. To their surprise, it bore letters, faded but still legible in the right light. The word read simply, "property." The rest was obscured. Officials clamped down immediately, banning reporters from filming close-ups and instructing rescuers to remain silent. But secrecy only fueled speculation. Theories exploded online: a military container, a sealed lab experiment, even whispers of something extraterrestrial hidden in the Rockies. Scientists at the site insisted on a simpler explanation. Perhaps the Turners had stumbled across forgotten debris, and in attempting to investigate, suffered a fatal fall into the crevasse. Yet the families struggled to accept this. If Mark and Emily had found something, why would their bodies have been preserved directly above it, as though pinned in place? That night the glacier groaned with another shift, sending echoes through the valley like distant thunder. Crews paused, fearing collapse, but the ice held. By morning, the metallic object had shifted further into view. Its surface was now cracked, a jagged seam running across its face. Peering inside with cameras, investigators were stunned to see what lay within. Papers, still pressed flat and frozen solid, lined the interior. Most were illegible, blackened by water and ice, but one page, caught against the glass, displayed bold print, an invitation. Identical in style and design to the one found earlier, but this one addressed to a name no one recognized. The shock spread quickly. Why would another wedding invitation, nearly identical to the Turners', be sealed inside a metallic container hidden beneath the Glacier? And who were the names written on it? People with no known connection to Mark and Emily. Sheriff Daniels, now overseeing the case, ordered the container sealed and transported under guard. But before it could be moved, the Glacier shifted again with a deafening crack. A new fissure opened beside the crevasse, widening with alarming speed. Flashlights probed the darkness, illuminating something that made even the most skeptical investigators recoil. The fissure revealed not just ice, but the edge of a second container, buried even deeper, and within it, the frozen silhouette of a human hand pressed against the glass from the inside. The frozen hand inside the second container transfixed the recovery team. Pale and distorted, its fingers were splayed wide, pressed firmly against the frosted glass, as if frozen in the act of reaching out. For a long moment, no one moved. Radios crackled with questions, but none of the investigators could find the words to describe what they were seeing. It was no longer just a matter of skeletal remains buried in ice. This was deliberate. Someone, or something, had been sealed away. Sheriff Daniels ordered the area cleared and secured, but word leaked quickly. Reporters stationed at the base of the mountain latched onto the rumor of a body in a box, and speculation reached fever pitch. Families of the Turners, already overwhelmed by the discoveries, demanded answers. "If there's someone else up there, we need to know who they are," Emily's mother pleaded during an interview. "What does any of this have to do with my daughter?" Scientists attempted to offer rational explanations. Perhaps the containers were part of a long-forgotten research project, meant to preserve samples in extreme conditions. But none could explain why a human figure would be inside one. Theories spiraled further. Online forums buzzed with talk of secret military experiments, cryogenic preservation, even paranormal possibilities. Meanwhile, teams worked cautiously to free the second container. It was lodged deeper in the glacier, requiring hours of cutting through dense ice. Each strike of a drill seemed to provoke groans from the mountain, vibrations rattling through the crevasse. Some rescuers swore they heard faint echoes, like knocking sounds, coming from within, though others dismissed it as shifting ice. By evening, the panel covering the hand was cleared enough for investigators to confirm the outline of a body inside. The figure appeared dressed in formal clothing, a dark suit, the faint shimmer of what looked like a tie. The frozen face, though blurred by frost, carried features disturbingly well preserved. It was not skeletal remains, but a body sealed in remarkable condition. A discovery like this was unprecedented, and officials struggled with how to proceed. Sheriff Daniels insisted the container remain sealed until forensic teams could examine it under controlled conditions. But as preparations were made to transport it, another problem arose. The glacier's thaw was accelerating. Cracks widened, ice shifted unpredictably, and experts warned that the window for safe recovery was closing fast. Pressure mounted to open the container on site. "If we wait, we could lose it," one investigator argued. Others feared contamination or worse, releasing something that had been deliberately hidden. That night, under the cover of floodlights, the decision was made. The panel was carefully cut open, frost spilling out in shimmering clouds. Cameras recorded as the glass fractured away, exposing the interior for the first time in decades. The sight drew gasps. Inside lay a man, his skin waxy but intact, eyes half open as though staring through the ice. In his frozen hand was a piece of paper, crumpled but legible. It was another wedding invitation, this one dated 1979, 22 years before the Turners vanished. The names on it bore no connection to the Turners, but the invitation's design was identical, down to the font and style. Investigators exchanged bewildered looks. Why were multiple invitations spanning decades turning up in these impossible places? What tied them to the Glacier? Before answers could be pursued, the mountain gave a roar. A massive section of ice collapsed into the crevasse, sending rescuers scrambling for safety. When the dust cleared, they realized something chilling. The collapse had exposed yet another cavity, and within it lay not one, but several more containers, their dark shapes stretching deeper into the glacier like a buried archive waiting to be uncovered. The collapse revealed a hidden chamber within the glacier, its walls glistening with fractured ice and the eerie outlines of more containers embedded deep within. Floodlights illuminated the scene, their beams catching metallic edges, some stacked neatly, others tilted as if shifted by centuries of pressure. The discovery turned what had been a recovery mission into something resembling an archaeological dig, though the contents were far from ancient relics. Investigators rappelled into the cavity with cameras, documenting row after row of rectangular containers, each one sealed in thick glass and metal. Some appeared empty, but others bore the faint outlines of objects, and in several disturbingly human silhouettes were visible. News of the chamber leaked within hours, igniting a media frenzy. Reporters labelled it the Glacier Vault, sparking wild speculation. Was this a government facility hidden beneath the Rockies, a secretive experiment, or something darker, never meant to be found? Sheriff Daniels struggled to maintain control, insisting the site remain closed to the public. But the images already spreading online told a different story. The families of Mark and Emily Turner watched the coverage in stunned silence. What were they doing up there? Emily's brother asked. Why were they right above all of this? As recovery teams worked, more invitations were retrieved. Some were loose within the ice, others clutched in frozen hands. Each carried a date spanning decades, 1965, 1972, 1984. Different names, different locations, yet always the same ornate design. Forensic analysts confirmed the paper and ink were authentic to their respective years, preserved impossibly well in the frozen vault. The pattern was undeniable. These were not random artifacts. They were part of something systematic, spanning generations. Scientists debated whether the Turners had stumbled upon the vault by accident, their deaths the tragic result of a glacial collapse. But as more evidence surfaced, that explanation grew harder to accept. Several of the frozen bodies were not twisted by natural causes, but positioned, arms folded, hands clutching objects, faces turned toward the surface. It was as if they had been placed deliberately. One forensic anthropologist whispered a chilling thought. These aren't victims of nature, they were arranged. The atmosphere at the site grew heavy with dread. Workers reported unsettling sensations in the cavity, feelings of being watched, sudden drops in temperature, even faint echoes of voices that seemed to come from nowhere. At first dismissed as stress, the reports multiplied until even seasoned investigators admitted something about the vault felt wrong. Late that night, while most of the team rested, a security camera left running inside the chamber captured something extraordinary. The footage later leaked showed one of the containers fogging from within, ice forming across its glass surface as though reacting to movement inside. For 30 seconds, the outline of the frozen body shifted, its hand twitching almost imperceptibly, before settling again. Officials quickly denied the footage, calling it a glitch, but those who had seen it firsthand swore otherwise. The next morning, while examining one of the newly exposed containers, a rescuer noticed a paper pressed against the glass. Clearing frost away, he read the words in horror. It was yet another invitation, but this one was dated not decades ago, but the current year, 2021. The names printed were unfamiliar, but the location written across the bottom was unmistakable, the very glacier they were standing on. Before he could process what it meant, the ice beneath him cracked sharply, a deep groan echoing through the vault as though the mountain itself was waking. The crack thundered through the chamber, silencing every sound but the groan of shifting ice. Rescuers froze where they stood, their headlamps darting nervously across the jagged walls. For a moment it seemed as if the glacier would collapse entirely, sealing the vault forever. Then the sound tapered off, leaving an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Sheriff Daniels called for an immediate evacuation, but not before a handful of specialists insisted on retrieving the most recent invitation. With careful precision, they chipped away the frost until the paper came loose. Miraculously preserved, its edges crisp despite decades of ice, the invitation bore the ornate script identical to the others. Only this time, the date printed was just months away in 2021, with a reception location listed as Glacier Hall. The absurdity struck the team like a blow. Glacier Hall did not exist, yet the name seemed to echo the very chamber they were standing inside. For the Turners' families, the revelation was devastating. Reporters hounded them with questions. Was this proof the couple had been lured to the mountains by something more sinister than a hiking trip? Had their invitation, 2 decades earlier, been part of a chain stretching across generations? Online communities exploded with theories. Some argued the vault was evidence of a cult, using the mountains as their burial ground, each invitation a macabre symbol of initiation. Others claimed it was government experimentation in cryogenics, with the weddings nothing more than coded references. A smaller but growing number suggested something supernatural. The invitations were not man-made messages at all, but artifacts of a ritual far older than the people who now discovered them. Inside the chamber, tensions mounted. The team debated whether to seal the vault and walk away or continue probing its secrets. Daniels pressed for caution, but the federal agents on site argued that abandoning such a discovery was impossible. "This isn't just a crime scene," one said. "This is history, or something beyond it." Against growing unease, they pressed forward. Cameras were lowered deeper into the crevasse, their beams cutting into blackness. What they recorded stunned even the most skeptical investigators. The containers did not end in a neat row. They descended layer upon layer, stacked like shelves in a library stretching farther than the lights could penetrate. And along the icy walls, carved into the stone itself, were markings. Symbols, not scratches as once thought, but deliberate etchings, repeating patterns that spiraled down into the darkness. Linguists called in later would admit they bore similarities to no known alphabet, though some symbols echoed those used in ritualistic traditions across disparate cultures. The deeper the cameras went, the stronger the sense of unease grew among those watching. Even through the feed, some claimed to hear faint whispers, like overlapping voices carried on static. At first dismissed as interference, the whispers grew clearer until a single word was heard distinctly. "Welcome." The footage cut abruptly as the camera line snapped, its feed swallowed by the abyss. Panic spread through the command tent as officials scrambled for answers. That night, while the team debated next steps, a snowstorm swept over the ridge, burying the camp in white. Visibility dropped to nothing, radios filled with static. Yet those still awake swore they heard knocking sounds, measured, deliberate, echoing from the glacier itself, as if something deep within the vault was signaling back. When morning broke, the storm eased, and the rescuers returned to the chamber. What they found stopped them cold. One of the containers closest to the surface was no longer sealed in ice. The frost had melted away completely, its glass fogged from within, and inside, the silhouette of the frozen figure had shifted, its head now tilted directly toward the opening. The discovery of the shifted figure sent waves of unease through the team. Photographs taken before the storm clearly showed the body facing downward, its features obscured by frost. Now its head was tilted toward the opening, eyes hidden behind a glaze of ice but aligned unmistakably with the chamber entrance. Some investigators refused to approach, insisting the storm had caused the movement. Yet geologists dismissed the idea, noting that no collapse or shift in the ice around the container had occurred. The figure had moved, and no one could explain how. Sheriff Daniels ordered additional security posted at the site, but whispers had already spread through the camp. Rescuers muttered about the knocking sounds from the night before, wondering if they had been connected to the movement. The sense of dread thickened as forensic teams attempted to photograph the container more closely. When they wiped frost from the glass, they found something new. The frozen man's hand was no longer curled against his chest. It was raised, palm flat, pressed against the inside of the glass, as though reaching out. News of the shift leaked almost instantly, reporters seizing on the image of the outstretched hand. Headlines declared, "Frozen man moves after 20 years and Glacier vault alive." Experts were called in to calm the frenzy, but their explanations sounded hollow. How could tissue preserved for decades in ice change position without external interference. Meanwhile, more invitations surfaced. During drilling near the chamber's edge, workers uncovered another envelope encased in frost. This one was dated 1990, its ink faint but legible. The names bore no connection to the Turners or the other invitations found so far. Yet the design was identical, as though every invitation across decades had been crafted by the same hand. Investigators pinned them side by side on a board, creating a chilling timeline that stretched backward for over half a century. The implications were staggering. Who had created these invitations, and why did they keep turning up tied to frozen bodies in the Rockies? That evening, forensic teams attempted to open the container with the shifted figure. The decision was controversial, many fearing contamination or collapse, but the demand for answers outweighed caution. Under bright floodlights, specialists cut slowly into the metal frame, each hiss of the saw echoing off the ice walls. The atmosphere was suffocating, every eye fixed on the glass as sparks flew. Finally, with a groan of metal, the panel loosened. Frost spilled into the air, a mist that clung to skin and burned lungs with its chill. Inside, the figure was revealed more clearly than ever. The man's features were eerily intact, his skin pale and waxy, lips tinged blue, eyes half-lidded as though caught between waking and sleep. In his raised hand, pressed firmly against the glass, he clutched something. Investigators pried it free, a folded slip of paper, its edges wet but legible. When unwrapped, the words sent a shiver through the room. It was a wedding invitation, but unlike the others, this one carried no names, no date. Only a single line written in elegant script, "You are already invited." Silence filled the chamber. Sheriff Daniels read the words aloud twice, his voice breaking. The families of the Turners, already devastated by the discoveries, demanded to know what it meant. But no one had an answer. Theories raced. Was it a warning, a prophecy, or proof that those who entered the vault had become part of its pattern? Before the debate could continue, a sound shattered the silence. A deep, echoing crack reverberated through the glacier, far louder than before. The ground trembled, headlamps swung wildly, and from the depths of the chamber came a groan, long, low, and unmistakably alive. The groan reverberated through the glacier like the breath of something waking after centuries of silence. Ice cracked along the walls, flakes showering down onto the rescuers below. Panic rippled through the chamber as workers scrambled for the ropes, desperate to climb out. Sheriff Daniels barked for order, but even his voice quivered under the weight of the sound. It was not the groan of ice under strain. It carried resonance, almost like a voice. One investigator whispered what many already feared. "It's coming from beneath." Forensics halted the container examination as attention shifted to the newly formed fissures. Cameras lowered into the widening cracks revealed layers of ice breaking apart, exposing cavities deeper than anyone had imagined. The footage was unsettling. Strange patterns etched across the walls, geometric and deliberate, repeating symbols that matched those found on the earlier containers. They stretched downward into blackness, disappearing where light could not reach. "These aren't natural fractures," a geologist admitted reluctantly. "They're markings. Someone, or something, carved them." Above ground, reporters pressed relentlessly for information. Rumors swelled of voices in the glacier, fueled by leaked audio recordings that captured faint reverberations during the groan. Analysts slowed the audio, claiming they heard words hidden in the frequency. Some swore the sound repeated a phrase, "Join us." Officials denied the claims, calling it distortion, but doubt had already taken root. The Turners' families, overwhelmed by grief and fear, demanded the site be shut down. Emily's mother pleaded with reporters, "This is not giving us closure, it's pulling us into something worse." Her words went viral, amplifying the case far beyond Colorado. Yet the work pressed on. More containers were exposed as ice collapsed further. Several were empty, their glass fractured from within, as though whatever they had once held had escaped long ago. Others contained only artifacts, rings, photographs, and in one case, a wedding cake topper sealed perfectly in ice, its tiny figurines locked in an eternal embrace. Every new discovery raised the same question. Why weddings? Why this repeating motif across decades? Anthropologists theorized that the motif represented a ritual, perhaps an offering or symbolic union between the living and the frozen. But no one could explain how modern invitations had appeared in pristine condition or why they continued to surface. Late that night, while the storm outside battered the mountain, the surveillance cameras left running in the vault captured another anomaly. One of the containers at the far wall fogged heavily, and within it the silhouette of the frozen figure moved. This time there was no denying it. The shift was deliberate, a turn of the head toward the camera, eyes reflecting faint light from within the ice. Seconds later, another container fogged and another, until nearly half a dozen appeared to stir. The feed cut abruptly, the cameras overloaded by interference. When technicians restored the signal, the vault looked unchanged, except for one horrifying detail. A fresh wedding invitation now lay on the floor directly in front of the containers. Its surface was dry, untouched by frost or melting ice, as though it had simply appeared. Rescuers retrieved it with trembling hands. The ornate script bore no names, no date, no location. Only 2 words written in flawless ink. "Reception begins." Sheriff Daniels stared at the card in stunned silence. He had no words, only the creeping dread of inevitability. And from the depths of the glacier, beyond the reach of their lights, the groan returned. Louder this time, closer, shaking the chamber as though something massive was shifting toward the surface. The second groan was deeper, more insistent, rattling metal equipment and sending a fine mist of ice crystals cascading from the ceiling. Floodlights flickered in the chamber as rescuers and investigators braced themselves. Radios buzzed with frantic chatter, voices overlapping in panic. Sheriff Daniels ordered an evacuation, but the narrow ladders and ropes slowed their retreat. Cameras lowered into the fissure continued to transmit, capturing unnerving images, entire slabs of ice shifting like doors on hidden hinges, revealing cavernous spaces that had been sealed for centuries. The markings carved into the ice grew denser the deeper the cameras went, spirals converging into symbols that resembled invitations themselves, loops and flourishes mimicking the ornate designs found on the cards. Linguists reviewing the footage gasped. "It's the same hand," one muttered. "Whoever made the invitations carved these walls." That suggestion unsettled even the most skeptical officials. If true, it meant the motif had not been coincidental, but intentional, repeating across decades or even centuries. As the cameras descended further, they captured something chilling. In the dim light far below stood what looked like an archway carved entirely from ice and stone, towering and symmetrical, its surface etched with the same patterns. Beyond the arch, the footage flickered with static, but faint shapes loomed, rows of containers stretching into blackness, too many to count. Before technicians could adjust the feed, the camera cable snapped taut. For a moment it held, then slackened as if something had yanked it downward. The feed cut to static. The loss of the camera triggered alarm in the command tent. But inside the vault, something even more terrifying was happening. The container with the shifted figure cracked audibly, its glass groaning under invisible pressure. Frost spiderwebbed across its surface before splitting wide. Floodlights glared off the mist as the panel gave way, collapsing inward. Rescuers rushed forward but froze as they realized the frozen man inside was no longer slumped. He stood upright, skin pale, eyes glassy, clutching the same nameless invitation against his chest. For several agonizing seconds he did not move. Then, as if gravity reclaimed him, the body toppled forward onto the ice. The invitation fluttered from his hand. A medic knelt quickly, checking for signs of life. "He's dead," she whispered, "frozen solid." But even as she spoke, the invitation dissolved into moisture, vanishing before their eyes. Fear surged through the group. None dared touch the body again. Sheriff Daniels ordered it bagged and removed, but hesitation slowed every motion. Cameras continued to record, broadcasting the surreal moment to a world already captivated by the story. Online, millions debated whether they had just witnessed a hoax, a miracle, or something supernatural. That night, as the body was transported to a secured facility, seismic monitors spiked again. The glacier rumbled with renewed violence, echoing through the valley like thunder. Back inside the vault, those still present swore they heard not just groaning ice, but voices, layered, overlapping, chanting in a language that clawed at the edge of recognition, words that sounded eerily like vows. As the noise swelled, another fissure split open, wider than before. From its depths, faint light pulsed in rhythm like candles in a cathedral. And just audible beneath the chants was the haunting sound of music, a melody eerily similar to a wedding march rising from the darkness below. The faint melody echoing from the fissure unsettled everyone in the chamber. It was unmistakable, a wedding march, warped by the acoustics of ice and stone, yet still familiar enough to chill the rescuers to their core. Some insisted it was the wind, funneled through caverns to mimic a tune, but the rhythm was too precise, the notes too deliberate. Radios filled with nervous chatter as Sheriff Daniels tried to keep control, though his voice cracked with strain. "We pull out now," he ordered, but curiosity held several investigators back. Cameras were once again lowered into the fissure, this time reinforced with stronger cables. As the feed flickered to life, it revealed an astonishing sight. Beneath the archway captured earlier lay a vast hollow chamber, a natural cathedral sculpted by ice, stretching farther than the lights could penetrate. Along its floor were rows of containers, hundreds at least, arranged in perfect symmetry like pews in a church. And at the center, illuminated by the camera's glow, stood an altar of stone, its surface covered in frozen objects. Among them were more invitations, dozens scattered like fallen leaves, their ink impossibly preserved. The camera zoomed closer, focusing on the altar's centerpiece. There, encased in ice, was a book bound in dark leather, its cover etched with the same ornate patterns as the invitations. The symbols were unmistakable. Before the feed could continue, static cut across the screen. Technicians scrambled, but the last frame held long enough to show something even more disturbing. Behind the altar, in the shadows, a figure seemed to stand. Motionless, upright, its outline blurred by frost, but unmistakably human in scale. The image froze there before the feed collapsed entirely. Panic surged through the camp. Some demanded the Glacier be abandoned and sealed, but federal officials overruled them, arguing that what lay beneath could not be ignored. Daniels privately confided to his deputies that he feared the Turners had not simply died on the mountain, but had been drawn into something far larger, something that had claimed others before them. Meanwhile, the Turners' families, still camped at base, grew increasingly distraught. Emily's mother sobbed when shown the footage of the altar, whispering, "She wanted her wedding to be perfect, not this." Reporters seized on the images, dubbing the site the Ice Chapel. Theories spiraled online: a hidden cult, a secret society, a supernatural covenant bound to the mountains. Each theory had one chilling thread in common: the Turners' disappearance was no accident. Back in the chamber, workers continued to chip away at the ice near the fissure, hoping to gain a better view of the hollow. But with every strike, the Glacier groaned louder, the melody swelling as if in response. Some swore they heard voices layered within the music, speaking vows, names, and words in languages long forgotten. Just as the team prepared to withdraw, one worker spotted something glinting in the ice wall. It was a ring, gold, set with a diamond, perfectly preserved. When pulled free, its engraving was revealed. Inside, etched in delicate script, was a date: July 14th, 2001, the very day Mark and Emily Turner had been married. Gasps filled the chamber. The ring was Emily's wedding band. But how had it ended up here, deep within the ice chapel, far from where her body had been found? Sheriff Daniels turned the band in his hand, dread settling like a stone. The discovery confirmed their connection to whatever lay below, and as if to punctuate the revelation, the fissure widened with a violent crack, and from the depths of the ice chapel came a new sound, not music this time, but applause, faint yet unmistakable, as though a crowd was waiting in the dark for the next ceremony to begin. The sound of applause reverberated through the fissure, echoing unnaturally against the walls of ice, until it felt as if the entire glacier were filled with an unseen audience. Some rescuers clamped their hands over their ears, swearing the clapping grew louder the longer it went on, though microphones registered only faint static. Sheriff Daniels shouted for everyone to retreat, but the team's focus locked on the widening crack. on the suggestion that something alive or worse aware was beneath them. A second camera was lowered, its light catching the vast chamber again. This time the feed lingered longer, steady despite the growing interference. The rows of containers stood like silent witnesses. The altar gleamed under a frost-laden arch, and invitations littered the ground like confetti. But now the figure behind the altar was clearer. Frozen, yes, but unmistakably human in form, standing upright with hands clasped together as though presiding over a ceremony. Some argued it was a trick of ice, a statue formed by chance, but others swore its outline was too precise, its posture too deliberate. When the camera zoomed in on its face, static consumed the screen once more, but not before the blurred suggestion of eyes seemed to open. Above ground, experts debated desperately. Anthropologists argued that what lay below was evidence of an ancient ritual site repurposed across generations. Geologists insisted no natural process could explain the preservation of invitations across decades. And theologians, drawn into the debate, warned that the repetition of weddings and vows suggested a symbolic covenant of unknown origin. At the base camp, Emily's brother collapsed when shown the footage. "They were married into this," he whispered, horrified. "It wasn't a honeymoon, it was a trap." Meanwhile, the glacier groaned again, a low, grinding sound that shook loose chunks of ice from the ceiling. Rescuers scrambled for safety, but the fissure widened further, revealing a path descending into the chamber below. Against Sheriff Daniels' pleas, federal agents demanded entry. "We need to see what's down there," one said, his voice taut with obsession. "We're on the edge of rewriting history." Tension erupted among the team, half demanding retreat, half insisting on discovery. Finally, a small group was chosen to descend. Ropes anchored into the ice as they lowered themselves into the frozen cathedral. Their headlamps illuminated details unseen in the footage. The containers were massive up close, each etched with faint spirals echoing the ornate designs of the invitations. Some bore handprints frozen into their glass, pressed from within. Others stood empty, lids ajar, as though once occupied. The altar loomed larger than expected, its surface littered with frozen relics, rings, veils, fragments of clothing, and dozens of invitations spanning decades. But most terrifying was the book. Up close, its leather cover gleamed with a sheen that seemed resistant to frost. Symbols scrawled across its spine pulsed faintly in the lamplight, as if alive. One agent, overcome by curiosity, reached forward and brushed the cover with his glove. The moment he did, the sound returned. Applause, louder this time, echoing all around them, accompanied by the unmistakable swell of the wedding march. The ice beneath their feet vibrated as though the chamber itself were alive, resonating with the noise. Then, from the shadows behind the altar, came movement. The figure once thought frozen tilted its head slowly as if acknowledging their presence, before one hand lifted, pointing directly at the intruders. The gesture was unmistakable. The figure's hand, long thought frozen stiff, now extended toward the team with deliberate intent. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber fell silent, the echo of the wedding march fading into a ringing stillness that pressed against their ears. Sheriff Daniels, watching from above via the camera feed, whispered into the radio, "Get out, now." But below, the federal agents hesitated. One of them, trembling but resolute, stepped closer to the altar. His headlamp beam cut across the figure's face, illuminating features that defied explanation. The skin was too intact, the expression too knowing. Eyes that had seemed glazed with frost reflected light in a way that suggested awareness. Before anyone could react, the pointing hand curled into a fist, then opened again, dropping something onto the icy floor. It clinked against the ground. A ring. The agents scrambled to recover it. Under the glare of their lights, the inscription was revealed. The initials MT engraved on the inside. Mark Turner. Gasps filled the radios. If Mark's wedding band was here, then what had been found earlier with Emily's remains was not the whole story. Panic surged. Emily's body had been recovered near the glacier's surface, but Mark's had never been conclusively identified. Only a boot and fragments assumed to be his. Now his ring appeared in a place where it should never have been, delivered by a figure that should not have moved. "We have to go," one agent insisted, but another shook his head. "Not yet. This is bigger than the Turners." Against orders, he reached forward toward the book resting on the altar. His gloved hand brushed the frozen leather, and the chamber erupted in sound. Applause thundered once more, joined by whispers that overlapped and tangled, a chorus of voices repeating vows in countless languages. The ice vibrated beneath their boots, cracks spiderwebbing outward, as though the glacier itself rejected their presence. The agent wrenched his hand back, but it was too late. The book shuddered, its cover splitting at the seams. Frost exploded outward in a cloud that blinded their lights, and from within the pages, invitations burst forth, hundreds of them, fluttering like snowflakes despite the still air. They drifted through the chamber, glowing faintly, each card bearing names and dates stretching across generations. Some matched the invitations already collected, others listed names no one recognized, and a handful bore names that had not yet lived. One agent grabbed at a card, only to recoil in horror when he saw his own name written across it, paired with a date only months away. Radios crackled with chaos as the team shouted over one another, voices breaking into panic. Sheriff Daniels screamed for them to ascend immediately, but the ropes above had frozen stiff, encased in a sheen of ice that hadn't been there minutes before. They were trapped. Below, the figure behind the altar lowered its hand, clasping them together once more as if in satisfaction. The applause grew louder, shaking ice loose from the ceiling. And then, from the depths of the chamber came a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing across the frozen floor as silhouettes began to emerge from the farthest rows of containers. Figures, tall and indistinct, walking toward the altar in silent procession. The first of the silhouettes stepped into the beams of the rescuers' headlamps, and what they saw tightened every throat. These were not statues or illusions in the ice. They were figures, dressed in formal attire from eras long past. A woman in a tattered lace gown, its hem blackened with frost. A man in a dark suit from the 1950s, his tie stiff with ice. Behind them, more emerged. Dozens in total, men and women in wedding garb spanning decades, their movements slow, deliberate, as though frozen bodies had somehow remembered how to walk. Their eyes reflected the lamplight with a glassy sheen, and each clutched something in their hands, some invitations, others rings, a few carrying fragments of flowers preserved impossibly in the cold. The team below the fissure backed toward the ropes, but the frozen lines remained sealed in ice. Radios filled with panicked shouts. "They're moving! They're moving!" Above, Daniels ordered backup, but the storm raging outside made immediate rescue impossible. Trapped, the investigators could only watch as the procession grew nearer, their footsteps a steady rhythm echoing through the cavern. The applause that had filled the chamber now faded, replaced by a low hum, voices layering in harmony. It was not song, but something darker, a chant of vows repeated endlessly. "For better or worse one," the words overlapped, whispered in countless voices, some deep, some childlike, others in languages long forgotten. One agent, trembling, aimed his light at the altar. The figure presiding over the chamber remained motionless, hands clasped, head bowed slightly as if officiating. The newly arrived figures formed two lines, walking with precision, until they stood facing each other, creating an aisle leading directly to the altar. The rescuers realized with horror what they were witnessing, a wedding procession. But who or what was the bride and groom? Before the question could be answered, one of the agents screamed. An invitation had fluttered from above and landed at his feet. His light caught the names written in elegant script. His own name paired with the name of the woman standing frozen in lace at the front of the procession. The date was today. His panic was immediate. He tore the card in half, but the pieces dissolved into frost before they hit the ground. The woman in the lace gown tilted her head toward him, her frozen smile stretching impossibly wide. The team scrambled, pounding at the ice, sealing their ropes, their gloves tearing at the frost in desperation. But the ice refused to break. Another invitation drifted down, this one landing near the second agent. His name, too. He dropped to his knees, sobbing as the chant grew louder, the aisle filling with figures that seemed to wait for them. Sheriff Daniels screamed into the radio, his voice breaking, "Climb, damn it, climb!" But there was no escape. The chanting crescendoed, shaking the very walls of the glacier. At the altar, the frozen officiant finally moved again. Its head rose slowly, and in a voice carried through the ice like a funeral bell, it spoke a single phrase: "The ceremony begins." At that moment, the ice floor beneath the rescuers split wide open, a gaping fracture revealing darkness so deep it seemed bottomless. From its depths surged a blast of air colder than death, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable sound of bells, wedding bells tolling for the living. The tolling of the bells reverberated through the chamber, each note shaking the air with unnatural weight. The rescuers clung to the frozen ropes, their breath ragged in the choking cold. The figures lining the aisle stood still now, heads bowed in reverence, their frostbitten hands clutching rings, bouquets, or invitations that glowed faintly in the dim light. The officiant at the altar raised its hands slowly, and the bells fell silent, replaced once more by the heavy sound of silence. For a moment, the only noise was the cracking of ice beneath the rescuers' boots. Then, as if on cue, two more figures emerged from the farthest rows of containers. Unlike the others, they looked newly preserved, their skin pale but intact, their clothing recognizable. A denim jacket Emily had been photographed wearing on her honeymoon trip, and Mark's old hiking gear. The rescuers gasped. The Turners were walking down the aisle. At first, some believed they were hallucinations, memories conjured by the stress. But as the couple drew nearer, their features became clear. It was Mark and Emily, their expressions eerily blank, eyes glassy with frost, yet unmistakably them. They moved with the same slow, deliberate cadence as the others, walking between the rows of frozen witnesses. One agent screamed Emily's name, his voice echoing across the chamber, but she did not respond. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward him, and in a voice that seemed to reverberate from the glacier itself, she whispered, "You're next." Panic erupted. The rescuers clawed at the ice, sealing their ropes, their gloved hands bleeding from the effort. But every attempt only deepened the frost. Invitations continued to fall from above, each one bearing names of those present, pairing them with frozen figures who waited silently in the rows. The chamber had chosen new participants. Sheriff Daniels, frantic, screamed into the radio for immediate extraction, but interference drowned his words in static. The agents trapped below had no way out. Mark and Emily reached the altar, standing before the officiant as if prepared to exchange vows. Their frozen hands joined together, rings already glinting on their fingers. The officiant raised its arms higher, and the chanting began again, louder this time, rising in waves that shook the cavern. The Turners turned slowly toward the rescuers, their glassy eyes fixing on them with unrelenting focus. One agent, trembling, drew his sidearm, firing into the ice in desperation. The sound thundered in the enclosed space, shards flying. But the bullet only ricocheted harmlessly, embedding in a container nearby. The glass cracked, spilling frost into the air, and from within, another figure stirred, pressing its hand against the glass, as though eager to join the ceremony. The rescuers screamed, pulling at their ropes, pounding at the ice, begging for help that would not come. Above, Daniels could only watch helplessly as the feed flickered, his team swallowed by shadows. Then the camera caught one final horrifying image before the signal cut entirely. Emily Turner standing at the altar, turning her head fully toward the lens, her lips moving in perfect clarity. The words were simple, but they froze Daniel's blood. "Bring them all." At that moment, the bells resumed, louder than ever, shaking the mountain as though the Rockies themselves were tolling for the living. The bells rolled like thunder through the mountains, echoing far beyond the glacier. At base camp, those monitoring the feed dropped to their knees, clutching their ears, swearing they could feel the sound inside their bones. Radios erupted in static, and then silence. The link to the team inside the chamber was gone. Sheriff Daniels, pale and trembling, ordered an immediate evacuation, fearing a full collapse of the glacier. But even as they prepared to pull back, spotters stationed on the ridge shouted in alarm. From fissures across the glacier's surface, faint plumes of mist were rising, each carrying scraps of paper that drifted like snow into the sky. When caught, the scraps revealed themselves to be invitations, thousands of them, each written in flawless, ornate script. Some bore names of the missing, others bore names of the living, including investigators standing at the camp. Panic spread. Technicians scrambled to salvage the last recordings from the feed before it went dark. The final frames revealed the rescuers still trapped below, surrounded by the frozen procession. Mark and Emily stood at the altar, their hands joined, their faces twisted into cold perfection. The officiant raised the strange book above its head, and invitations swirled around the chamber like a blizzard. Then the image cut to black. Above ground, Daniels demanded reinforcements, but the storm raging across the Rockies delayed helicopters and snow vehicles. For hours they could only wait, the silence broken by the faint sound of bells drifting through the valley. Meanwhile, the invitations falling from the fissures began to draw locals from nearby towns. Curious climbers and villagers trekked to the site, holding the cards in disbelief. Each bore their names paired with strangers and dates that had not yet come. Some laughed nervously, calling it a hoax. Others burned the cards immediately, too afraid to hold them. But when they tried to leave, many found their cars wouldn't start. Compasses spun erratically and paths once familiar seemed altered. It was as if the mountain itself refused to let them go. Inside the command tent, Daniels stared at the recovered scraps pinned to the wall. His own name was on one, paired with a woman he did not know. The date was today. His hands shook as he stuffed the card into his pocket, too terrified to admit what he'd seen. At dawn, as the storm began to ease, the glacier shifted once more with a violent roar. A fissure widened near the base camp, spilling shards of ice across the tents. From the crack, something tumbled out and landed in the snow. It was a camera, one of the team's, encased in frost but intact. Daniels rushed to it, desperate for a clue. When powered on, the screen flickered with static before revealing a short recording. The footage showed the chamber below, but it was empty. The containers stood open, the altar bare, the rows of frozen witnesses gone. Only the Turners remained, standing motionless at the altar. The camera panned shakily, as though held by trembling hands, before settling on the book. Its cover had split open, its pages glowing faintly with pale light. On the top page, a fresh invitation rested, written in ornate script. The name printed across it made Daniels stagger backward in horror. It was his own. Before the screen went black, a faint voice whispered from the feed, low and resonant as though spoken from the ice itself. "The ceremony isn't over." Sheriff Daniels staggered out of the command tent, clutching the camera, his breath fogging in the frigid dawn. He wanted to scream, to deny what he had seen, but the weight of the invitation bearing his own name crushed his chest. Around him, base camp was unraveling. Investigators packed equipment in haste, some too frightened to speak, while others argued violently about whether to abandon the glacier or press deeper. Locals drawn by the falling invitations had gathered near the ridge, clutching cards with their names, unsure if they were part of a hoax or something older and more sinister. One woman sobbed as she showed her card to Daniels. It bore the name of her late husband, dead 20 years, paired with her own. The date written was today. Daniels couldn't respond. His voice trembled too much to offer comfort. Helicopters finally arrived mid-morning as the storm cleared, but their pilots reported strange turbulence, their instruments flickering wildly when approaching the glacier. Two turned back, refusing to fly closer. The one that landed brought federal reinforcements and specialists who immediately secured the perimeter. They ordered locals evacuated, but many refused, believing leaving would only anger whatever force lingered in the ice. While officials debated, another fissure split open across the glacier, wider than any before. A boom echoed through the valley, and from the crack poured not mist but light, pale, unnatural, pulsating in rhythm like a heartbeat. The invitations falling from above glowed faintly now, visible even in daylight, as if written with fire beneath the ink. Terrified, Daniels returned to the camera, replaying the footage over and over. In every viewing he noticed details he had missed before. In the empty chamber, shadows seemed to linger near the containers, faint silhouettes as though the procession had not disappeared but simply moved out of sight. And the Turners, Mark and Emily, looked less like victims and more like participants, their faces calm, almost reverent, as if they had embraced their roles willingly. That evening, when darkness fell, the bells returned. This time they were not distant. They rang clearly, resonating through the entire valley as though a cathedral had risen from the mountains themselves. The sound froze every conversation, every movement. Reporters lifted cameras skyward, locals clutched their invitations tighter, and rescuers dropped tools mid-motion. Everyone listened, paralyzed. The bells were soon joined by a low hum, a chorus of voices reciting vows. The words echoed in countless languages, yet somehow every listener understood them. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, until death and after. Daniels collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, but the voices filled his skull. He staggered away from camp, toward the fissure that glowed with pale light. He could feel it pulling him, calling his name, beckoning him like a groom summoned to an altar. Several agents ran after him, dragging him back before he could cross the unstable ice. But in his hand, clutched tightly, was a fresh invitation that no one had seen him pick up. It bore not only his name, but the name of Emily Turner. The date remained unchanged. Today. And as the bells reached a fever pitch, shaking snow loose from the peaks, the fissure erupted. A gust of icy wind roared across the camp, extinguishing lights and knocking men to the ground. When visibility cleared, everyone stared in horror. Standing at the edge of the fissure were figures in wedding attire, dozens of them, their faces pale and glassy, invitations clutched in their hands. At the front stood Mark and Emily Turner, their eyes fixed on Daniels, their lips moving in unison as they whispered a single phrase that carried on the frozen wind. "The groom has arrived." The figures stood motionless at the fissure's edge, their presence silencing the camp. Floodlights flickered as though straining against the darkness that had settled over the glacier. Daniels, trembling, clutched the invitation tighter, the ornate script glowing faintly as though alive. Mark and Emily Turner remained at the front, their glassy eyes fixed on him, their expressions neither hostile nor kind but expectant, as if awaiting a ceremony that had been centuries in the making. Federal agents drew their weapons, shouting warnings into the frozen air. But the figures did not flinch. Instead, they parted slowly, creating an aisle that stretched back into the glowing fissure, into the depths of the ice. At the far end, faint shapes could be seen moving, forming rows upon rows like an endless congregation. The bells tolled again, resonating so powerfully that the ice itself seemed to pulse with each note. Invitations continued to fall from above, carpeting the snow in ornate white cards, each one bearing names of those present. Some agents found their own names scrawled alongside strangers long dead. Others found cards that bore no names at all, their blank spaces inviting completion. Panic surged, but retreat was impossible. The helicopters on standby reported engines stalling, their blades frozen mid-turn by an unseen force. Roads leading out of the valley were blocked by sudden avalanches, as if the mountains themselves had sealed shut. The camp was trapped. Daniels, pale and broken, whispered that the Turners had not vanished in 2001. They had been taken, drawn into a covenant hidden in the glacier. Now it was calling again, demanding new witnesses, new vows, new participants. Some investigators begged to burn the invitations, to shatter the containers, to end whatever ritual lingered. But the ice resisted all attempts. Fires extinguished themselves in seconds, weapons jammed inexplicably, and every crack of gunfire echoed back as laughter. The aisle leading into the fissure glowed brighter, beckoning. Then, as the bells crescendoed, Emily raised her hand. The procession of frozen figures began to move forward, each step synchronized, their eyes locked on the living. Some clutched rings, others veils, others bouquets frozen in eternal bloom. It was a wedding march, but this time the bride and groom were not Mark and Emily. They were the living, pulled into the ritual whether they consented or not. The first agent to resist was dragged screaming into the aisle by unseen hands, his body vanishing into the light. His invitation drifted to the ground moments later, now bearing a completed script with his name paired to one of the frozen figures. Others fled, only to find themselves circling back to the same fissure, as though the mountain itself had trapped them in a loop. Daniels collapsed, the invitation in his pocket burning against his chest. He knew the truth. This was not a crime to be solved, nor a mystery to be unraveled. It was a covenant older than memory, bound to vows spoken and vows repeated. The Turners had not stumbled upon it by chance. They had been chosen, and now, so had he. The final recording recovered from the site ends here. The camera captures Daniels rising unsteadily, stepping toward the glowing fissure as Mark and Emily reached out their frozen hands to welcome him. The bells toll one last time, followed by applause so thunderous it shook the peaks for miles. Then the feed cuts to black. No bodies were ever recovered from the glacier. Only the invitations remained, scattered across the snow, their script unreadable, except for a single line that appeared on every card. Until death and after.